good to hear from you again. Girl, what a coincidence. I was just thinking that weekend out on Cumberland Lake, and that one time in Baton Rouge when we made out in the rain, where we went chasing falling stars on a hill at your daddy's farm.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second day of the 11th Annual FAV Summit. Please welcome to the stage Senator Jeff Brandes.
Well, if you can tell by the sound of my voice, I really enjoyed last night. And I hope you guys enjoyed yesterday's conference. What an amazing set of speakers we had yesterday, and what an amazing opportunity to hear from Kathy Wood and frankly, Riley Brennan. And they did a fantastic job. This morning, I am honored to provide the award. So we've done a Leadership and Innovation Award for many years at the Florida Automated Vehicle Summit, just recognizing somebody in Florida who stepped up and done some amazing work and is a champion, let's say it that way, is a champion for kind of all things mobility. And because we need those champions. I think one of my big takeaways from my time in the legislature was everything really required two things to be successful. It required a vision and it required a champion. And today's awardee is Fiona McFarland. And I can tell you, Representative McFarland has been an incredible champion for mobility as the chairman of the House Transportation Committee. Fiona McFarland graduated from the military academy, the Naval Academy in 2008, served as a surface warfare officer, served in the Pentagon for a while, came out and joined the Florida House. And I remember kind of meeting her just as we started. And she came to me and she says, I really want to get involved in mobility. And I said, great. And so we got to serve together for a couple of years. And it's been incredible to watch you grow and watch all the wonderful things you've done. In fact, this year, one of the pieces of legislation that we passed was a bill that basically requires the state to begin to radar roads for automated driving. And that was something that Fiona placed into legislation. And so I am honored today to award you the Innovation and Leadership Award from the Florida Automated Vehicle Summit.
I think what I've done right is follow in Jeff's footsteps. I was in the House long enough to overlap with him for 2 years, and for those of you who dabble on the fringes of policy, let me tell you how great this man is. Other states are leading on AV in different ways, but this is why Florida is different. Senator Brandes put proactive measures in state law to make Florida a receptive environment for autonomous vehicles. Other states have done it through executive order, through the governor, or through their economic development arm, but Jeff invested in educating other members of the legislature on what the future could be for an automated Florida, and he put it in state law. It doesn't matter who comes after Jeff, who comes after me, it's codified in state law now, and that is tremendous for Floridians and the benefits that we all may have. Jeff laid the groundwork for EVAV. We've got a lot more work to do, but we're standing on the shoulders of giants. And what I'm most excited about, and Jeff will be right there with the Florida Policy Foundation, is to go up. There's been tremendous conversations about advanced air mobility, and I think that's the next frontier for us here in Florida. Thank you so much for this award, Senator, and thank you all for being here.
introduce now Ariel Wolf. Ariel Wolf leads Venable Automotive and Connected Mobility Group, where he counsels clients facing complex legal and policy issues at the intersection of automation, electrification, connectivity, data privacy, and cybersecurity. Ariel is a recognized thought leader who works closely with vehicle manufacturers, technology companies, advanced equipment suppliers, software developers to navigate the emerging landscape being transformed by the automated vehicles and mobility. Ariel, where are you? All right, you're up.
Well, really good morning to everyone, and regards from Washington, D.C., which is, of course, and I'm not an expert in these things, that's what the victim in a horror movie hears just before, well, you get the point. I think they look in the mirror. I wish I could say D.C. isn't that bad, but I think you've all read the news. So it's pretty rough up there. It's glad to be down here in Tampa. Always a phenomenal time to be at the Florida AV Summit. I'll start by saying a big thank you to all the organizers of the conference. I would say it's a highlight of the year for anyone who's involved in this industry. And kudos to Senator Brandes and the whole FAV staff for putting this on. I'd also just note a special shout out, of course, to the tech team involved here. And when you have a lawyer trying to make a PowerPoint, the struggle is real. So keep up the good fight. Just make sure, speaking of, how we're going to advance the slides here. Is this the clicker? Yeah. All right. So we're going to talk about the federal regulatory environment for autonomous vehicles, something that's very much in flux, something that we pay attention a lot to. And I just recognize here at the outset, I think he's here, my partner David Benelli, with the law firm, there he is in the back there, who came from the NHTSA Chief Counsel's office, who he spent 15 years there and then at Lyft. And we're working in DC and in offices across the country, and as of this year, one in Tampa actually, to work with the AV industry, the association, as well as individual companies and clients in this very fast-moving, fast-changing regulatory and legal environment, the state and federal level. So, what does it mean when we say the federal regulatory environment in the context of autonomous vehicles? Well, of course, we're talking about two things. And I'll just note, we could talk about the state environment. That's a different talk. But in the federal side, we're talking about Congress and the Department of Transportation, primarily. And both sides play an important role in regulating AVs, but in different ways. So let's start with Congress. When we talk about Congress and its role in AV regulation, we're broadly referring to federal legislation that will create a national standard to support the deployment of autonomous vehicles. And we're going to drill down in some of that today. In the absence of a federal law, which is the current state of play that we have, certain aspects of AVs are legislated on a state-by-state basis. And I say certain aspects because, of course, there's a bifurcation of regulation of motor vehicles in general in the state and federal level. The federal government design, construction, and performance of vehicles. That's why they all look the same and not differentiated across the states. But there's also, at the state level, the regulation of the operation, insurance, titling, registration, those kinds of things. So the state level, we're seeing a lot of that in the AV space. But on the federal side is what we're going to talk about today. So what are the components of federal AV legislation? We start with Congress. We want to talk about this because this is something that's really, it's a hot topic right now. It had not been. It sort of was big in 2016, 2017, 2018, and then, let's say, went on hiatus for a little bit. You may have noticed a slight uptick in polarization in Washington, D.C. and Congress. And so we've had our challenges trying to get some progress here. But the reality is we're seeing a little bit of a breakthrough. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's happening. So what are the elements of AV legislation? Just a quick review. I know some of you are familiar with this, but I want to just make sure we understand the contours of AV legislation. What is it that we need to accomplish in order to get the safe and swift deployment of AVs in the country? So the first thing is we have to raise the exemption cap. And what does that mean? So you can't, folks are, I'm sure, are familiar. Vehicles have to be designed a certain way. You can't just put out a vehicle on the road that doesn't have a steering wheel, a brake pedal, and so forth. And so we need a process for novel vehicle design. How do we do that? How do you do it safely? You can't just let people sort of tinker around in their garage and put a vehicle on the road that doesn't have a steering wheel. And so there has to be a process for doing that. So that's the first thing. Second thing is expanding testing. Now, what does this mean? This is referring to a process that's in law right now that allows legacy manufacturers to make changes to vehicle design and test it on the roads, not to commercialize it or sell it, but to test it on the roads. And it's sort of a quirk in a law from 2015 that made it, that bifurcated it. If you were a manufacturer as of that date, you can do it. If you were not, then you do not have access to that testing of those kinds of vehicles. And so that's a problem. It doesn't allow new entrants, very important, significant new entrants, tech companies and so forth, to be able to have access to that testing exception. It's an exception, not an exemption. And that's something that needs to get fixed. That's an element of legislation. This so-called make-and-operative thing, what does that mean? Well, there's a provision in federal law. It's one of the few in the Motor Vehicle Safety Act that actually applies not just to manufacturers, but to anyone that's really dealing with the car, a larger group of entities dealing with a vehicle. You can't take a vehicle and make inoperative an aspect of vehicle control and then put it back out on the road. Something that blocks the mechanism for braking or interferes with the steering wheel. Well, you can imagine that's a problem when you have an issue. You can't design novel vehicles. You have to use vehicles off the shelf, but the ADS interferes with those things. Now, it's not a black and white issue. There's interpretations that are helpful here, but what we want to see is federal law that clarifies when ADS is operating the vehicle, it's not running afoul of the make-and-operative provision. So that's something those three things are pretty core. And then, of course, clarifying federal and state roles. There's not a push by the AV industry to just wipe away all of the state laws, just have one big federal law. The reality is the push is to have a preservation of that bifurcation of federal and state roles. And so what we don't want to see is states regulating design, construction, and performance, because you'll get 50 different laws in the books and different kinds of designs. That would be a problem. We want to preserve that approach that I think has led to a lot of great innovations in America. Move forward here. So now we're going to talk about the legislation itself, what's been out there. So you're probably familiar with the 2017 efforts and the legislation that Congressman Latta put in, the House of Representatives, Senator Thune and Senator Gary Peters from Michigan, had put forward. But really the last time Congress officially considered these things was 2017, 2018. There's a lot of battle scars there, and a lot of folks, I'm sure some in this room were involved in those discussions, and it was quite a fight. It did not, I think we all know, did not result in enacted legislation, which is why here we are on Groundhog Day again trying to do this. And I think what we're seeing today is that these bills and these concepts, plus new ones, we'll talk about in a second, are actually gaining new life. And there's some excitement, cautious optimism in DC. We will see. But what are the sticking points? So let's talk about some of the sticking points. And every time we bring this forward, talked about the core elements of AV legislation, well, what's the problem? Well, it seems pretty straightforward, right? Well, as we know, it's not that straightforward. The first one is this issue of liability. Well, that's not terribly surprising. I think it's something that does need to be addressed. Now, I think we tend to take the position, the industry side, that the existing liability regimes can fairly accommodate this. But what we've seen is certain stakeholders, including the trial bar's lobbying arm, the American Association of Justice, uses its leverage to try and get at a couple of issues. One is pre-dispute arbitration contracts. So try and prohibit the use of pre-dispute arbitration in certain aspects, whether it's robotaxi or consumer-facing AV businesses. They also seek to overturn a decades-long Supreme Court precedent related to the preemption of state common law claims. There's a lot of trying to relitigate, almost literally, old wounds and kind of get at those things. And that's one of those sticking points. You got to figure it out. And I would just say here, and I'll repeat a couple of times, you can't just operate in the policy dimension. We're operating at the policy dimension and the political dimension at all times in DC. And so you can have a great policy argument, great debate, feel like you won, feel like, well, I think we really made some headway there, only to find out that really the real conversation is happening at the political level. What's the next election cycle? Who's up for re-election? What are the campaign contributions? And that's the reality. Just being honest about what it looks like in DC, you have to be operating at both of those dimensions. Workforce considerations, lawmakers have expressed concern about potential workforce displacement. We all know about that. And that's really in the trucking industry. And one of the things that we've seen since 2017, and I'll mention a couple of times as well, is this movement into the commercial vehicle space and the trucking space. We know that's taken place, but in 2017, that wasn't a big issue in Congress. And so the legislation that was done then that did not apply to any vehicles over 10,000 pounds, which is the cutoff for commercial vehicles. So that's one of the things that we're dealing with new today, is that we're bringing that in because, of course, it's such an important use case to this industry. As soon as you go into that area, though, we're talking about labor groups, stakeholders that have important concerns and considerations about the future of workforce. And that's just something that has to be reckoned with as we go forward. But it was present before, and we've seen how to kind of deal with it. We've also seen concerns over matters related to safety and privacy. Some other grab bag issues, as I note here, that have come up in the past. Some driver assistance kinds of things, and that's always going to be part of the conversation. Again, back to politics, there are going to be members that have different interests here and there. So you have to sort of assemble legislation that gets at all those things to try and get past the line, so to speak. So, as I said, these things were not resolved in 2017, 2018. But wait, there's more. On top of the existing set of issues, Congress has added to the plate of what needs to get done for AV legislation. Let's see here. So I want to go back to, I mentioned privacy briefly. I want to go back to that for just a second. That was an issue that came up in 2017. They talked about privacy and connected vehicles and things like that. I would say not at a terribly sophisticated level. So what does it mean then today? I think we're in a different place in 2023. Well, there's a lot more pressure to act, and I'll just give one example, sort of moving aggressively in this space. And there's an interplay here of the state and federal roles. So just, I guess, a little over a month ago, July 31st, 2023, the California Privacy Protection Agency announced that it was launching a review of the data privacy practices of connected vehicle manufacturers and technologies under the California Consumer Privacy Act. And the executive director of this agency said that the enforcement division of the privacy of this agency would be, quote, making inquiries into the connected vehicle space to understand how these companies are complying with California law and when they collect and use consumer data. So explicitly moving into the space, we have privacy now part of this, and that is going to absolutely part of the federal conversation as well. That's going to be part of any federal legislation. But the big one that we need to talk about just briefly here is on national security. This is what's been, the other things that I've mentioned have been part of the conversation in some respects all along, but today, what is new and what was not the case in previous efforts for federal AV legislation is this national security economic competitiveness piece. And this is a top issue for Congress writ large. I'll start with economic competitiveness with China. There's a lot of focus on the U.S. ceding its leadership to China and other countries. And that's a multi-factor kind of thing, but they're looking at through improper means, subsidies and things like that. We don't know exactly how China and how much China is subsidizing its domestic AV industry, but we can assume that it's being done in a sizable way. I think there's some assumptions along those lines. And what does that mean for the AV industry? Does that need to be addressed in AV legislation or something else? But the other dimension really is national security. And you've probably seen how this has been a greater focus generally, but it definitely has spilled into the AV space. What we're seeing now is growing concern with Chinese AV companies testing on US roads and what's being done with that data that's being collected there. We also see a discussion about outbound US investment in Chinese companies or industries that may support Chinese military. You probably heard of, some of you maybe heard of CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US. That's about inbound investment into the US. Now there's an outbound investment regime that's being stood up. And that's new, that's being driven by these concerns. And whether and how that affects the AV industry remains to be seen. Legislative language for these issues has appeared in standalone bills this year, as well as amendments to both versions of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a bill, I think it's one of the few remaining bills that actually passes every year, a quote-unquote must-pass legislation. Even the legislation to fund the government is no longer must-pass. We'll have a shutdown, I think, this year. We'll see. But at least when it comes to the military and authorizing those programs, I don't think they've missed it yet. Don't count Congress out in screwing it up. And of course, the last thing is AI. I don't want to go too much into this, but it's a hot button issue in Congress right now. There's a lot of initiatives. AVs and autonomous vehicle technology is absolutely part of that conversation. But the only thing I want to say here, because there's a lot to say on AI, is we need to keep our eye on one issue. A lot of the discussion is around generative AI and some of the impacts of workforce and how that's going to affect all these different industries. What really seems to be lost on folks is in DC and elsewhere, the AV industry has been working with this and using this for over a decade in various capacities. And the focus has been safety. I mean, the focus has been, let's not put a car out there that's going to run into someone. And so AI and safety. And so there's a lot of practical experience in the AV industry that is not the same as a new banking app that has a more sophisticated chatbot. Not to put it down, or a ChatGPT. I mean, it's going to be transformative. But in a sense, they could be different conversations, and there should be an effort to leverage some of the expertise and experience of the AV industry here, rather than trying to just lump it in with all of the other different kinds of conversations around AI. So I'm just going to quickly move through these next slides. I want to talk about prospects for legislation here in 2023. Do they exist? We've got the old issues and the new issues as challenges before us. So what does that path look like? Well, just a quick primer here on the committees that we're dealing with. House Energy and Commerce, that's the big one. Jurisdiction over AVs writ large. It has the broadest jurisdiction of any authorizing committee in Congress, but most relevant is the committee's jurisdiction over motor vehicle safety. The House T&I committee, as we call it, Transportation Infrastructure, that's over, it speaks for itself. Aviation, highways and bridges, transit and rail, pipelines and maritime. And that's on the House side. And so some of this math, I mentioned there's policy, there's politics, and then there's just quirks of the system. And this is one where we've seen in the House, you have two committees that deal with this. On the Senate side, you have one. And so the issues, you negotiate those things in different ways. One interesting thing is that, we're talking about prospects. In July, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, back to this notion of, are we actually seeing a breakthrough here? Maybe a breakthrough is the wrong word, but we're seeing new activity that's, I think, manifestly different than what we've seen in the past 5 years. In July, the House Energy and Commerce Committee held a hearing, and it was a legislative hearing. They had draft legislation on AVs that was sponsored by Representatives Latta from Ohio and Debbie Dingell from Michigan. It was held right before the August recess, so we'll see how much attention it gets as we come back. But legislative language, we're moving forward. There's talk about compromise. No one wants to do anything for posturing purposes. No one wants to do a big showpiece. Maybe some of the staff, but members of Congress, they want to get something done. That doesn't mean we'll get something done, but they want to get something done. And then what I can announce today, some of you may have seen, but it's really only just starting to get out there, is, I guess today is Friday, right? So in 4 days, and Wednesday of next week, the House T&I Committee, Transportation Infrastructure, will be holding a hearing on autonomous vehicle technology. There'll be a focus on trucking. Witnesses will include the trade association we we represent the Autonomous Vehicle Industry Association and the executive director. There'll be the CEO of Aurora will be testifying, Chris Urmson. The head of ATA, American Trucking Associations, Chris Spear will be testifying. And Kathy Chase from Advocates for Auto and Highway Safety. I probably got the title wrong. It's going to be an interesting conversation. The T&I committee is very large. It has a lot of strong opinions. It's going to be, we're already starting to see some interesting issues will come up here. And a little bit of theater, but I think a good conversation. Again, there's a desire and willingness and momentum to get some of these things done. So we'll might have to read the room a little bit and see, are they going to be serious about this, or are we going to get kind of bizarre questions and personal attacks and things like that? Stay tuned. We're actively working at it as we speak. So that's what it looks like in Congress. I think we are going to see more movement on the legislative side. And partly, we'll get to this at the end, with respect to this issue of 2024 being an election year. 2024, the election year, things start to get really screwy in DC. And folks know right now they have a window here before we get to the silly season, especially a presidential election year. We got to get something done in 2023. That's the momentum. So now we just quickly touch on what's the other component here, the federal regulatory agencies. And what we see there are a couple of different things. Federal AV legislation would call for updating of certain federal regulations, but we've seen it can take a long time. So what can these agencies do in the meantime? We want to talk through a couple of those things, what they're currently doing. I'm not going to go through a whole list of what they can do, but what are they doing? NHTSA has been active, but kind of swinging in different ways. All right, they'll do a lot of guidance and try and encourage companies to do things. Then administration changes, we'll look at other things. And one of the first big thing they did was a standing general order, which was issued to all the companies. I think probably some of you know that quite well here. That requires crash reporting for ADAS, driver assistance level 2, and automated driving systems. And it was issued, it's an enforcement action, sent out, service of process to 110 different companies. I think it's up to 115 now. They had to serve that on all of those companies, and they issued an update to that. But that was the mechanism. It came 6 months under the new administration. What I'll say here is just one thing, and I think as an industry, we always have to continue to keep learning and question our assumptions. When that came out, I think the manner in which it was put out, I'm happy to say openly because I've said it to NHTSA plenty of times, the manner in which that was done, I think, left some things to be desired, to put it mildly. A little self-restraint here. But what I would say is more than 2 years after it, it actually has turned out to be a pretty decent way of showing that the AV industry is safe. It's a mandatory reporting mechanism. It's burdensome, it's cumbersome, it's not pleasant the way it was done and how it's carried out. But those data sets are made available publicly. And the data, I think, is very clear. The AV industry is always looking for a way to show how safe it is. Here you have data sets that I think, the data sets themselves are somewhat problematic, but they do show a very clear narrative that AVs are safe, are very safe, and that's on the AV side. I'm not speaking to the driver assistance component of that data set, which is dominated by one particular company. So that actually, and we got to keep our eye on that. We've been pushing some of the state regulators and state agencies and other policymakers say, look at the SGO data. That's where you need to look. You don't need to do more data collection. It shows what you need to see to a certain extent. There's this talk about a demonstration program. NHTSA did announce that they're going to launch a proposed rule this year on a demonstration program. What does that mean? I'm not going to speak for NHTSA here because we haven't seen the proposal yet, but when you hear about the NHTSA demonstration, they call it the AV STEP program. It's an acronym I won't even try to untangle here. The AV STEP program, that's really the only thing that NHTSA has to do in that space is try and look at novel design or purpose-built vehicles. If you take a vehicle, as we know, if you get in a Waymo or a Cruise or Emotional, wherever it is, just an off-the-shelf vehicle as it currently stands, they don't need to get permission from NHTSA to do what they're doing. That's the fundamental reality of the regulatory apparatus we have now. So a demonstration program really only has value or function with respect to novel design vehicles. And so I think that's been the struggle that NHTSA has been looking at once they decided to go down that path. What are they going to be doing to continue to try and accelerate AV deployment in the dual-use vehicle context? So that's just want to make a point about that as you hear about this. That's really the tension that's going on. We've had discussions with the agency about this. That is the tension. What can be done on the dual-use side, because that's the part that's expanding pretty rapidly. And then, of course, we continue to want to see activity in the regulatory docket to remove barriers. Very quickly, on the FMCSA side, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, this is trucking specific. We've seen activity at FMCSA in just a couple of respects. The first one is this warning triangle petition. If you're familiar with the trucking, heavy-duty trucking, there's a requirement to put out the warning triangles. I'm sure we've all seen them and interacted with them. Kind of difficult to do without a driver in there. When this issue was first flagged, I remember hearing some conversations about, well, we can comply with it by having a drone run out and put the triangles out, or kind of interesting ways to comply with putting out those triangles. Now, one of the interesting things that we figured out, though, is that there is no underlying data at FMCSA from when this was put in place, I think in the 70s. There's no data that suggests this is effective relative to any other solution. I mean, that's just the reality. Shockingly, a regulation was put in place without any data or thought. I venture to say there are a few other examples of that in the Federal Regulatory Code. But once we understood that, I think some of the entities and the companies were able to understand, well, let's put in a petition to have another solution. And so there's cab-mounted beacons that are being proposed as an alternative to that, which they actually did the studies, can be quite effective, if not relative to the warning triangles, certainly in its own right. So that's an interesting development. We want to see that. It has to really get done, because you need to be able to comply with that in order to deploy these truly driverless truck. And then there's some proposed rules we're going to look to see on the federal, from the FMCSA. They say this fall, agencies have been known to miss deadlines. It happens from time to time, or actually every single time. But they've been saying it for 4 years. They did have a supplemental rule, so we'll see if that comes. So what's next? Of course, the picture is simply, I just don't know how to use PowerPoint. I looked up the word mysterious in the picture thing. Brought this up. There's been a lot of talk about, that might actually be the least mysterious thing that's going on right now in DC. But of course, my PowerPoint skills aside, what are we looking at in 2024? So I mentioned the silly season. We're going to presidential election. Things do start to shut down once we hit that. I think we need to see progress in AV legislation before the end of this year. If we don't get that, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to move something through in 2024. Every bill, every law ends up being sort of through the lens of who is this helping, which side, and that's going to be very difficult then when you start layering in the political aspects, which stakeholders are providing campaign funds and things like that. It's going to be very hard to move things forward. So then I think the shift, if we don't see, and if past is prologue, right, it's certainly possible, if not likely, that federal AV legislation will have a tough road moving forward. Maybe some of the national security aspects propels that in weird ways, where we see interesting provisions that affect supply chains. But maybe that's a propellant for the legislation. Remains to be seen. But if we don't get it, then a lot's going to be squeezed through the regulatory apparatus. And we talked about some of those initiatives and what they might be doing. You have to look at, I would just say, look at the timelines. Look at the way regulations work. So a demonstration program, I think there are probably developers and companies that are in the audience today that might be working on those things. Well, it is exciting, it is good, but a proposed rule that's issued even today, even if it was put in the Federal Register today, likely you got to take comments, you got to finalize it, then you got to stand up a program, minimum of a year, if not more. Now we're at the end of that administration. If you change administrations, things can go back to zero. So there's a lot of uncertainty about how that's going to proceed, and that's why, at least on the industry side, there's a lot of focus and a lot of push to have the agency do some more of the low-hanging fruit. Make tweaks, make some changes to some of the easier regulations we know that don't need to necessarily apply in context that don't affect safety. Make other kinds of changes, incremental, blocking and tackling kinds of things. Those things matter to the industry, so you just take things off the table. We'll get to the hard stuff eventually. There'll be enough pressure at some point. And so I think as we look ahead, those are going to be the dynamics that we see. And I don't think AVs will be the central issue in the presidential election coming up, but it's sort of a part of the backdrop of what the future of the country, how are we going to proceed. So in that respect, we'll keep our eye on it and happy to have additional conversations in that regard. I think that there's information how to reach me or David, and we're always happy to continue the conversation along these lines. So I'll wrap it up there. I know we got a panel to do. Let me ask if we have a minute or two for questions. I think we probably do. Yeah? Okay. Well, I'm happy to take any questions, so thanks very much. Okay, thanks. What's that? Do the panel? Yeah.
All right, Ariel's going to come back on stage as the moderator for the next panel about driving forward, the future of AV innovation and leadership. Here we have Richard Willder, the Uber's global head of regulatory and automated autonomous policy. We have Gregory Crandell, the general is the general manager of Holon US. We have Deana Haynes, is a real estate executive with nearly 20 years of experience and is the director of commercial real estate at ChargePoint, one of the largest nation's charging networks. So, Ariel, take it away.
Great. You'll be sick of me before we know it. So I'm going to introduce each of the panelists. What we're going to do here is everyone's going to get a chance to provide some opening remarks, and then we're going to have a brief conversation after that. So as Jeff said, Richard Willder is Uber's global head of regulation and autonomous policy. He leads the public policy and government affairs for Uber's autonomous mobility and delivery business, as well as Uber's broader global priorities for regulatory affairs and policy. Before Uber, Richard worked as a policy, political, and strategic advisor to the Honorable Josh Frydenberg? What are we going with here today? And the coalition government across a wide array of portfolio responsibilities. I'll introduce everyone, but we're going to go in this order for you to provide your initial presentation, or if the slides are loaded in a different way, we'll do it a different way. We'll just kind of roll with it. Gregory Crandell is the general manager of Holon US. He began his career as a third-generation GM employee, which grounded him with a historical automotive perspective, and through his mother's foresight, you wrote this, Gregory was able to experience a behind-the-scenes view into the challenges executive leaders encounter changing large organizations. After living, working abroad for 12 years in 3 countries, his goals include localizing innovative solutions, reinforcing the importance of the 3-gen principle. You're going to have to explain what that is. I don't think I can read that. But it involves genjitsu, the word. I'm going to leave it there. And expanding green space in metropolitan areas. Deana Haynes is a real estate executive with nearly 20 years of experience in the industry. She is Director of Commercial Real Estate at ChargePoint. She's expanding ChargePoint's leadership in the commercial real estate segment through the development of new technology solutions and business models that allow real estate organizations of all kinds to capitalize on the growing need for EV charging at their properties. Throughout her distinguished career, she has led global and domestic transformative business initiatives and strategic projects for high-profile clients and multinational corporations. Her professional career includes tenure at leading organizations, including Lend-Lease, Ernst & Young. She's worked with clients across industries, including financial services, insurance, technology, consumer products. My goodness, basically everything. Is there any, like, maybe you just need to say what you haven't worked in, I think might be the. So we'll start with Richard, who's going to give a couple of minutes, and then each panelist will speak for a couple of minutes, then we'll have a discussion on some of the synergies, and maybe not, maybe the divergences.
Thank you all so much for having me. It's terrific to be here, and a big thank you to the organisers. Obviously, I second what everyone said over the last couple of days about how extraordinary this event is, and it's amazing to be down here in Florida, enjoying some of this gorgeous weather. I'm going to run through this very, very quickly. We don't need to use the slides. I can just kind of race through it. But essentially, I think it's very important, first and foremost, to talk about Uber's changing perspective on what we're doing in the marketplace at the moment. Many of you will be familiar with the work we've done previously as a manufacturer and developer. Now we're obviously changing tack, having sold that portion of our business in 2020. And we're very focused on building the best possible platform for developers to deploy their technology and manufacturers to deploy their technology. That's where we're focused. That's our business that we're kind of leaning into more holistically outside the AV space as well. I'm going to move through this very quickly because I want to make sure we've got time for everyone to have a chat. But what I wanted to talk about today was our future and vision, our approach for a hybrid network going forward. Obviously, we have a tremendous number of conventional vehicles on our platform at the moment, and we see a future where autonomous vehicles and hybrid vehicle and conventional vehicles with drivers in them work side by side on the platform together. In fact, I think it's really important to call out that we see a future in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years, where we are going to see a significant absolute increase in the number of conventional vehicles and drivers on the road, as well as the number of autonomous vehicles. And we see them operating kind of side by side for an extended period of time going forward. I think it's fair to say that whilst not to kind of break hearts here, but whilst there are a tremendous number of supporters of autonomous vehicles and technology, they're not universally and completely at the moment winning hearts and minds. Completely. And I think one of the significant benefits of a hybrid network is being able to have us partner with autonomous providers, deliver a really innovative experience and help people gain exposure to the autonomous space over time. I want to very quickly cover off on just a couple of benefits that we certainly see in the autonomous space and about bringing this hybrid model together with both conventional vehicles and autonomous vehicles. First and foremost, introducing autonomous technology in a low-stakes environment to consumers. Finding a way to get them onto our platform, finding a way to have them experience it the way that, in any way for the right trip at the right time for them. And I think that's going to be a very important part of getting folks onto the platform and getting familiar with it when they're not necessarily exposed to it previously. I think the second benefit is letting, and I think this is a really critical one from our perspective, is letting autonomous vehicles shine in an environment that's suitable for them. It's pretty common sense, but while there's not a really clear, one of the things that I think is there are going to be a number of use cases where autonomous vehicles are not always fit for purpose in the immediate term. And these are trips perhaps where there are individuals with greater mobility needs, greater communication interaction needs in a vehicle, or simply someone who needs help with luggage. These are kind of trips that we see a hybrid network having a significant utility in helping people get through. There are going to be real benefits in getting people to use both switching between autonomous vehicles and conventional vehicles on the platform. And I think the last benefit that we certainly see is the option for incremental scaling over time. And the idea that over time, we're not going to forcibly push people, push the regulatory environment, push consumer expectations into a place where there needs to be forced adoption to get to a place where autonomous vehicles are operating at scale in their own independent network. A hybrid network mitigates that need and allows the industry to work together at the same time. There are 1,000 things we can say on this. There are a million things we could talk about. I don't want to take up a huge amount of time because we want to move on and get to the meat of the discussion. But certainly, we're really excited about the direction the industry's heading. We're so excited to lean into this space. We've got pilots across the United States with a range of different partners on both the mobility and delivery side of the business. We're excited to see where that goes. And I mean, this is going to be a really dynamic space over the next 10 years as we start to think about what our model and what our platform looks like, with an increasing number of autonomous vehicles on it. So big thank you for having us and looking forward to the discussion.
Great.
I can just do it.
Your choice.
I'll do it from here. I feel more comfortable here. Thank you. Let me go back to the Japanese reference that I made in it. That way we all feel more comfortable. You did a great job in trying to explain it. A big theme in my life has been mentors and people that supported me to get to be successful and to get to this point in my life, which is also what I see here with our vehicle. Quickly, my mother being an executive assistant to the vice president of General Motors, and him being my mentor throughout my career. So, and being involved with the Genbutsu, which is, being on site, checking it. It's really hands-on. So for Holon here, Holon is a new company. The vehicle you see here was launched at the CES show in 2023. And Holon is a new company, but the name of the company prior to that was Venable Electric Vehicle Systems. And what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of history about the vehicle, so in order to drive confidence in the, assemblability, the capability and safety of the vehicle, and then being able to deploy it. So Venable, 150-year-old German company. We've got 5 plants here in North America, about 2,500 employees, so we have a large staff in the United States and a tremendous amount of people throughout the rest of the world. Our expertise is metal bending and metal joining, along with just-in-time, just-in-sequence, what we do here in Spartanburg, South Carolina. So we've got that type of large assembly, capability that we do currently today. So we've got that experience. When you look at the vehicle here, again, back as I talked about my mom and my mentor, Mark Hogan, it takes a good team. It takes the top team to get things to the end game, to get this launched. And what you see here, we have from the design in our first engineering intent here was from Pininfarina. They developed 70% of the Ferrari's design, and the vehicle itself looks like a toaster. And they did a really great job of making it look as attractive as possible. So we've got the design now for the safety and capability of it. It's powered by Mobileye. Mobileye IQ5, which we'll launch with, and you know you've heard them, they're an Intel company, and we've been working with them for quite some time. In order to deploy it, we've got a very strong partner, which a lot of you know, Beep. Beep is not only a deployer, but a command center, and also the weight that from start to finish to make sure it's a successful launch. And we've been working with them for a long time, and this is another aspect in order for us to be able to come to start of production and then launch this vehicle. I'd like to talk about the vehicle capabilities just a little bit. Beyond the prettiness of the outside, behind it is a tubular space frame. It comes back to Ventler's capabilities. Tubular space frame is very rigid, but in a very terrible ride. So one of the things that we have done is put air ride suspension in it. Air ride suspension allows it to smooth out the ride, but it also gives us the ability to kneel it. Why do we want to kneel it? You can see the step-in height is just over 11 inches, but we have an automatic deployable ramp. That automatic deployable ramp will then be able, through a button on the outside of the door, through your smartphone. but it's in order to be inclusive. We want to give people that are either in wheelchairs or in scooters the ability to have freedom in their daily lives so that they can also enjoy transportation and moving around and feeling free. Inside the vehicle, we're working with a Tier 1 supplier that will give us the ability to have automatic securing of scooters and wheelchairs. Again, further to allow them to go out on their own, those that are in scooters or wheelchairs, to be by themselves. A lot of the times, as you probably know, they need another person with them to lock them down in the vehicle with the Q-straint system. So that's another aspect of the vehicle that we're really designing, and it takes up a lot of real estate in the vehicle at the time. It is electric. It is rear-wheel drive. It is asymmetrical. But the vehicle itself, we've been working a long time, and I'm going to go to the next page, that to design this, if you see for key mobility trends, I'd also like to give a very big thanks to JTA. If I look at the trends, they've helped us design this vehicle. They gave us the expertise of what they've learned over the years through their deployments. We've implemented that into the vehicle. And what you see here today, and we've got a lot of aspects and things that we've been able to improve on some of the other designs and companies that have released, so we've taken their learnings. On the right-hand side, when we look about key buying factors, the one I'd like to talk about is end user cost. The vehicle itself, we really promote automotive grade. Back to Benteler being a Tier 1 supplier, we know what our demands of the General Motors, the Fords, the Mercedes, and the BMWs that we serve today, their needs. There's a fit and finish, a tolerance, but also a quality perspective. This relates to the end cost that will come out and that we use on a daily basis. We need the maintenance cost low, and we need the uptime high. The parts on the vehicle, I would also just like to say that majority of them are off the shelf. Off the shelf batteries, off the shelf air conditioning, displays, a lot of things that are available on the market today, so we're not inventing anything new, things that you have in their vehicle, so that we will then implement. So thank you for letting me give my brief explanation.
Great.
Is this one on? Here we go. All right, I'll stay seated here too. So as Ariel mentioned, I'm Deana Haynes with ChargePoint, and it's great being a household name like Uber, but I think Greg and I need to do a little overview about our companies and who we are, how we operate. So for those that don't know ChargePoint, we operate across North America and Europe, and we're one of the largest EV charging technology companies out there. We have over 225,000, I think we're up to 250,000 plus ports installed, and that's both AC level 2 charging as well as DC fast charging. What I want to clarify for folks is that ChargePoint is a technology company. So we design software, we manufacture hardware, we provide services for EV charging, but we're not an owner and operator of charging stations. We sell our charging stations to businesses like real estate owners and operators to give access to EV charging to residents in multifamily properties, to tenants in office properties, to customers in retail properties, to fleet and fleet operators. So we're the technology arm, and when we think about how we grow our business, how we support our customers, how we support the industry at large, we look at a few different factors. We're really excited about a few different elements here, and just flipping through. What we see is that a lot of charging actually happens at home, overnight, or during the workday. Super excited about this when it comes to passenger vehicles. When we think about fleet vehicles, that landscape looks a lot different. It depends on the route. It depends on, is the route predictable or unpredictable? The length of the journey, the goods or people that are part of that route. So an e-bus looks a lot different than a last mile fleet in terms of the charging needs. From a commercial perspective, we see that vehicles in parking lots are looking a lot different, and there's an inflection point coming. Data now shows that it's about 2030 when electric vehicles take over for internal combustion vehicles, and I'm super excited about that. That is not too far in the future, and we are continuing to innovate and drive the industry forward based on that milestone. Another thing we're excited about is that EV adoption is happening across the country. It's not just in certain locations. It is widespread. Now, there's a part of the country that's yellow that you can see on the map here. They're a little slower to the uptake, but you can see that states like Florida and Texas and California and lots of the blue states here, blue in terms of color on the map that we see, they are really taking to EV, electric vehicles and subsequently EV charging. One other slide that I'll flash up and then we'll get to the discussion here. And this really relates to vehicles where we're seeing EV charging being deployed, is that major auto OEMs, it's not just Tesla, which I heard a good amount yesterday. It's not just Tesla, but major auto OEMs are committed to an all-electric future. And this runs the gamut from price point of vehicles to types of vehicles. We see the Rivian pickup truck, more affordable Chevy Volt, Mercedes, everything in between and outside of that. And so we're excited about the adoption that's coming that will drive our business, and we're also, again, excited about being able to support that business, support the transformation, and support the autonomous vehicles that are coming along with this transformation. So with that, I'm going to flip back to this slide and turn it over to Ariel.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Can make sure this is all working. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. One key takeaway out of the gate is that you guys know how to use PowerPoint. I do not. Absolutely. But no, I really appreciate all of the introductions here for the companies, because what we want to do is explore, it's not discussed in depth enough, to explore this intersection between AVs and EVs. We have not seen, at least I haven't seen in the policy space, I'm sure it's being talked about in the business context that you all are operating in. This kind of, I'll use the word convergence, but or inevitability. I want to put, I want you all to characterize it. But just to start with, I'd love to hear how each of you see this playing out, these two technologies, how they're going to interact, autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, over the next year or two in your respective areas. We've got a great panel here with ride-hail, shuttles and transit, charging infrastructure. So much going on. I know where I sit in the policy space in DC and regulatory side. But I'd love to hear from each of you how you see this playing out in the next year or two. And it'll be for all of you, so we can start with Richard.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I think it's actually it's incredibly healthy that it's not a huge discussion and debate and dialogue. It's a significant indicator that commercial players in the market are already taking it very seriously. I think, look, you folks will have more to say on this than I will, no doubt, but certainly from our perspective, this seems to be an increasingly normative requirement. We have significant electrification targets for our broader Uber network, and it's really encouraging to see the autonomous space taking this electrification challenge so seriously and being at the forefront of that. We see it as a leading indicator of how the rest of the market's going to transform and perform over time. I think just in terms of convergence from a policy perspective, I just see it as becoming an increasingly more normative requirement. It's just fascinating to me personally that there doesn't appear to be a significant need for a regulatory impetus here. Like business and commercial operators already have this front of mind, which is really exciting and a great start to things.
They're coming, we're running. I say that because from a vehicle standpoint, we're not the only one that's out there. and we have competitors that are coming, and we want them to come. There's a lot more different vehicles that are going to be deployed and available in the market. So we need to get ready for them in many different ways, from training, service, but there's different form factors, and what I have called in the past the Goldilocks and the Three Bears is that you're in each one of the deployments I foresee, even potentially for Uber, is that there's not going to be one form factor. It could be a 6-passenger. Our vehicle is 10 to 15, and then there are other ones that are coming that are going to be more than that. So in your depots, you're going to need to have standardization. You're going to need to have the ability to cycle them in and cycle them out, because we would like to be the majority of the vehicles that are used, but it's not realistic because you're going to have different needs at different times of the day for different functions. So there's going to be a tremendous amount of new developments coming in the next 2 years.
And to that point, when we think about the future, it's that you mentioned the different types of vehicles that are coming out. It's our ability to be able to support all of those vehicles. Maybe we'll get into the conversation around the NACS connector and how that looks in the space now with major auto OEMs adopting the Tesla charging adapter. But for us, it's not having a unique solution for every single type of vehicle. It's how do we actually design something that works across the board, that doesn't have to be bespoke to Holon's technology or some other solution. It's how do we actually create a seamless ecosystem that supports the entirety.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's a great overview of how this is all coming in different ways. I want to then follow that by talking about the other side of it. What are the challenges to the build-out of charging infrastructure for AV fleets? Right? I think we understand the convergence, we understand where things are going. I'll just note, and I want to turn it over to each of you to kind of think about that and share your thoughts. It was just a couple of years ago, always California. There was a California bill that would have required all AVs to be EVs. And it started out just no nuance. That's it, by date certain, and it was pretty soon, within a couple years. It was just a declaration. That had to get, and the industry side, get involved and say, there's different kinds of vehicles, different timelines, and inject some nuance there. And it ended up being, different kind of carve-outs. So I say that as a preface to getting each of your thoughts on kind of what are the challenges. If you say, well, everything has to be an EV, or there's infrastructure challenges, but there's also just the ability to make a certain kind of vehicle into an EV. They're not all the same. So I'm curious, what are those challenges for either just the transition or the infrastructure build out? I mean, we'll go, you want to, yeah, go ahead.
Sure, I can start.
Yeah.
There are so many challenges. We talked about one, which is I'll call it a plug for the sake of today's conversation. How do you actually plug in the vehicle to get it to charge and fuel and go about on the rest of its journey? That's one of the factors. Another is, where do these vehicles charge? In today's environment, and one of the slides I shared, a lot of charging, at least for commercial passenger vehicles, happens at home, at work, at retail locations. From a fleet perspective, they're depots, and at their locations, sometimes even, depending on the vehicle, take-home fleet, where those fleet vehicles charge at a person's home. But when you're looking at an AV, where do they actually go? Where are they parked? What is their journey? How do they charge throughout the course of the day? I think there's a lot to be sorted out. I don't know that there's one right answer to it, but there are a lot of different factors in terms of the 5 W's: where, when, maybe not why, but some of those questions that really need to be addressed, and I think there'll be an evolution in how they get addressed, and some learnings as we continue to build this out.
From the Holon perspective, we know we're not the incumbent. There's legacy transportation already there, so we need to be very careful of how we implement or get introduced into the network. Therefore, up front, there needs to be consultation of what the needs are. We've been doing that with Beep and talking with customers so that they know. I mean, there's going to be different requirements, not only from the electrical standpoint, but as Deana had mentioned, from parking the vehicles, how do you move them around? So these type of things we're really concerned about, because if we don't do the upfront work, it'll be a disappointment in how it ends, because the people that are operating them and need to do maintenance on them will be disappointed. So that's going to be a big challenge for us as we go into our deployments.
Certainly from a platform perspective, the infrastructure element is front of mind, and I think the chicken and egg of investment and where you deploy that based on the demand with electric vehicles, I think is going to be really critical, and trying to find a way to overcome that. And I certainly think there needs to be a more holistic understanding of the fact that everyone needs to play a role in this space. You mentioned the idea of like government mandates on electrification, and that's critical, and it's going to be a very important part of how we move towards that mode shift. But at the same time, there needs to be an understanding that government has a role to play in also supporting rollout of infrastructure and a range of other bits and pieces on that front too. I think it's a lot less, I think that's going to be a challenge for us, is to move away from being very directive in terms of how we're approaching the future of this space, and having everyone take ownership for a solution.
Well, let me push you on that just for a second. You mentioned the government has a role to play. Certainly we've seen, and it's hard to imagine a bigger push by the federal government and the U.S. government into the electrification space over the past, year, 2 years, I should say. How do you see that the government playing that role, Richard?
It's a good question. I don't have a very clear answer for you. I'm not going to have a very clear answer as to exactly how that is going to work. I think the only other thing I'd call out is like the significant difference between the way this is operating in the United States and the way this is operating in different markets around the world. And we don't have AV operations in different parts of the world, but we have significant electric operations in different parts of the world. And a federal and national approach has made things much easier in different markets, and being able to kind of push forward with investment in infrastructure relative to the US model, which can be a bit hodgepodge between states, as I'm sure you can appreciate. But exactly what the role looks like and what the role plays, it's going to come back to a real breakdown between the delineation of responsibilities between states, commercial enterprises, and the federal government, and playing in that space and see who wants to do what.
Right. Deana, let me ask you that. Similar question. The federal government's role, in your opinion, in this kind of convergence of AVs and EVs, is there a strong one? And you mentioned the connector, and there's certainly, I think folks have probably noticed, there's a little bit of money being thrown around at the federal government level in this space. Do you see the federal government playing some role, no role, primary role in this, as we talk about this convergence in the autonomous vehicle deployment in the electrification side?
So what we see right now is a small amount of money, $7 billion from the federal government to help deploy EV charging along major corridors. I think that it is a journey, that $7 billion isn't getting deployed all at once. So it will take time to, and for those that don't know, the $7 billion actually gets allocated to the states, who then determine where the charging infrastructure goes. And again, this is along major highways. So that takes a while. There's a process for that. But that's primarily, from my understanding, that's primarily to help drive EV adoption amongst consumers for fleets, again, along major highways. There's a lot of range anxiety that exists. Will my vehicle actually make it from point A to point B, maybe point C? So the NEVI funding, the $7 billion, is being rolled out to effectively support that. I actually don't think that I think to a certain extent it will help with AV and progressing AV deployment, but I don't know that it's going to do it all. I think that there's probably more to come and more that we'll see. And again, this journey from, well, let's start with passenger vehicles, let's start with major corridors, and then let's keep going, and we'll see how things start to shake out. I will also add that in addition to the federal funding, states and local governments and utilities are also providing funding, grants, incentives, subsidies to deploy EV charging and the construction that supports the installation of the charging. So to some extent, it will help support AVs, especially if they're electric. But I don't think that it's going to be enough to see this at scale and widespread.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. As you were speaking, you kind of made me think of, you really have to overlay passenger, it's really personal ownership and fleets. The conversation has to be thought of in that context because a lot of the challenges you're looking to solve and in the infrastructure side are about private ownership and passenger vehicles. And as you start to get the fleets, which whether light duty fleets or commercial vehicle and heavy duty, that's going to be a different kind of conversation. Greg, let me ask you this. So now we're starting to talk about some of the collaboration between different entities. Who's missing from the conversation, in your opinion, as you're looking to get your vehicles out and trying to have a conversation around charging and the infrastructure there? Do you see anyone that, or any entity or any group or governmental body that's not part of the conversation that you think should be part of that?
From the OEM to the deployment, say the city or the entity, through the general contractor, all of these parties are, in my mind, they're discussing. They're communicating very well. Waiting for the government, in our case, waiting for NHTSA to come out with their next ruling for the cruise origin. This is the next step to see how quickly we'll be able to release and get more vehicles out on the road, and we're going to have to work hand in hand with NHTSA because it shouldn't just be an open the gates and everyone can release their vehicle and start testing. But for us, I think we're coordinated from the OEM to the deployment to the general contractor for the infrastructure. We need to start working together, and they need to start maybe choosing more collaboration from the, like I said, NHTSA side.
So maybe it's not so much there's a dearth or we're missing someone, but there's the forum itself needs to be improved and how to cooperate.
I have a really big challenge because my parent company is German. In Germany, they're doing the same type of thing to get certification, and it's really laid out A plus B, and then you get to C. Explaining to them it's not that clear cut in the United States is really difficult for them to understand, which then makes them not want to come here. Actually, I don't mean to be, they're like, it's so hard. How do you know what to do? Who's going to get elected? Are they going to be the one that supports AV? Are they want us to change back to out of an EV? They don't like the wishy-washy part of it, so they tend to want to focus only on Europe because it's so easy to understand.
Where are we when the Europeans are looking at America and saying it's super confusing and can't figure it out? I guess that's part of, maybe it's part of a secret sauce we have, which is it's not so prescribed up front. I mean, that might be part of it, but it's an interesting call out.
Real quick, I completely agree with this because once we start to flow, especially with Florida being so open, it will then be an immense transformation of all the opportunities and people that come into the market. And this is, well, I'm biased, but this America is going to take over Europe really quick.
There are a lot of upfront confusion and startup issues, and then once it gets going, it gets going. Well, I want to pivot to the workforce topic. I'll just flag. We'll try and give a little bit of time for some questions at the end. So think about that in a couple of minutes if you have some questions for the panelists. Richard, I want to start with you. I mentioned earlier, and I think everyone's been talking about, one of the key topics in AV policy is workforce. And I think we use the term workforce, it's labor, there's a lot of things to unpack there. You talked about the deployment of AVs alongside conventional vehicles. Can you give us a little bit more on how you see that interacting and Uber's approach and workforce and scaling driverless operations in the context of an existing workforce and how that fits together? And there's a lot to unpack there, but I'd be curious.
Yeah, there's a huge amount to unpack. I think the first thing, just to reiterate, one of the things I mentioned when I spoke just now was that in absolute terms, we see a scenario going forward where in 10 years' time there are going to be more drivers on our platform than there are now. So we are going to see an absolute increase as well as not necessarily a percentage increase, but an absolute increase in the number of drivers on the platform, as well as we see an increase in the number of autonomous vehicles on the platform. I think really practically the benefits of a hybrid model and introducing this gradually, I mean, I tried to articulate a few of those very quickly, but certainly one of the things that I think is going to be very tangible in the immediate term are the separation of different types of trips. Someone going to the airport who needs help lifting their luggage into the car, this is something that's bread and butter in the mobility business for us, we have learnt a huge amount about the different types of trips people take, why they take trips, what they want to do. There are going to be different individuals who have different different desires and wants as part of their mobility needs, and as a result, they're going to want to choose different types of modality of transportation. And I think having that optionality, giving people a way to ease into the autonomous space and perhaps use it for one trip, a different trip in a different way, I think is going to be very, very interesting and very helpful. In addition to, of course, all the people who are going to be very excited about the novelty of trying their first autonomous vehicle. It's not going to be for everyone right away from day dot. So I think that's going to be the immediate term interesting piece, which is how you get folks to start thinking about different trips, different ways of incorporating autonomous technology into their mobility.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it seems like too often the conversation is this kind of monolithic or bifurcation. It's jobs, no jobs, driver, no driver. And I would imagine everyone in this room understands that it's a lot more complex than that. And there's just so many different facets of workforce issues and considerations, jobs, roles, and so forth, as this transformation occurs. And it seems incumbent upon companies and those participating directly in bringing that about to communicate that in a certain way. So Greg, kind of the transit side, how do you think about work for these considerations in that space, and what are the kinds of roles that you're looking at developing?
The goals and challenges. Number one, we're looking for a production location here in the United States. We would like to come farther south because more of our opportunities are in the south with the vehicle itself. We need to have a workforce that knows automotive. It's more difficult than just pushing the hand buttons, but has this experience about metal bending, metal joining. Is there a burn through in the weld? These types of things that takes a long time to train. But once we get through that, what we need to do starting now is start building a workforce of technicians and experienced people that can handle the machines themselves. We're going to have new systems that need to have people that go out and do service, maintenance on them. And we're working with Beep and talking with a local university here for a complete curriculum of what is it going to take to start building up a workforce that knows about it. So potentially then we can then hire them into our service and parts distribution, so then we can send them out. But these types of individuals, we need to start preparing for it, or we're not going to be ready, and that will be the stopgap for us. And then we won't be able to, the vehicles will potentially sit. And an asset like that, we need the depreciation to keep moving to be able to depreciate it.
Makes good sense. Now, I'm curious, Deana, you probably have a different or orthogonal take on kind of the jobs question of AVs, but charging infrastructure, how are you thinking about that from maybe a workforce perspective? Or is it, and the answer could be, we're not, we got to focus on the other. I don't want to prejudge the answer, but I'm curious if it started to make its way into your thinking of, are there going to be robo-taxi build out and deployment? Is it thinking managed by the companies themselves? Are you having conversations that you can talk about along those lines, and what are the kinds of jobs or workforce considerations that might arise in those conversations?
Absolutely can talk about this.
Okay, great.
So when we think about workforce, I think primarily it's on the engineering and technology side. It's the software design, it's the hardware design. Going back to earlier in our session here, it's how do we actually support all of these different vehicles with something fairly consistent, fairly easy to manage. And so we really focus on our engineering staff. But when it comes to our partners, we also work with electricians and contractors who need to install the technology, who need to maintain the technology, and how do we skill them up to be able to support this? When we think about AVs and where we're seeing the trends go, we also need to have strategy in mind and make sure that our engineering staff understands what to look for. So, for example, while we're not necessarily focused on innovating very significantly for AVs at the moment, and that's probably a different department, so they might be doing it, and I'm not privy to it. But I know that we do innovate to solve large challenges. So, for example, when we think about e-buses, there's union concerns around who plugs the vehicle in, and so we've come up with a solution where there's effectively a metal scaffold with a charger at the top, and a bus pulls in and it charges from the top and can actually be effectively hands-free, and there's no union disputes over that. And so we're innovating from that perspective. Talked about the Tesla adapter, NACS adapter, which is starting to become more of a standard in vehicles, and we'll start to see that in the coming years across OEMs. We're innovating to support both the NACS adapter and other adapters. So we're innovating from that sense and thinking broad brush. Again, we can't do that from a bespoke perspective, but we can do that at scale, at large.
That's great. Well, so it made me think, I want to push it a little bit further in the little time we have left, and we'll take a couple of questions. So going one step further, let's talk about novel vehicle designs, purpose-built vehicles. I think we have to settle on the right term for these vehicles. I always say both. But we're talking about, of course, vehicles that start being able to, let's wave the magic wand from a regulatory perspective, it all gets fixed, it all gets settled. You can take out the steering wheel, or whether it's the Cruise Origin or the Zoox vehicle or other kinds of things that we're talking about here. Let's talk about kind of the charging piece of that. And do you see that raising additional concerns from each of your different perspectives, right? We've got from trying to manage a ride-hail network. Start with you, Richard. And maybe not just the charging piece, but the safety piece. Like, how are you looking to onboard potentially those kinds of vehicles if that regulatory approval starts to come through? Maybe it's going to be so slow that you don't have to right now. I'm just curious from that perspective, and of course, Greg, from your perspective, you have an interesting vehicle design, and then Deana, from your side, you have to think about how does that charging occur? Maybe you don't have to think about it because of your role. But this is coming. It's happening soon enough. We can talk about some of the legal challenges or legal cases that are being brought forward to bring these vehicle designs coming. So I think the next couple of years we're going to really start to see it. So
I am far more interested in Greg and Deana's answers to mine, but I think from our perspective, this is going to move. It is going to move quickly, but it's going to move at a pace that's manageable. And I think certainly from a fleet perspective, from a network perspective, it's going to move at a pace that we're going to be able to. It's going to meet what the requirements are from a charging perspective and an operations perspective. So I'm less concerned about it, but I'm interested to hear your perspective.
Coming to the conference, it reinforces is that there's a strong demand for vehicles, autonomous vehicles, not only the Holon vehicle, but different form factors. This is a concern about what is going to happen in the depot, how it's going to sequence the charging, and how many units are going to be, how many vehicles are going to be needed, how many charging stations are going to be needed, and it's going to have to have a lot of pre-planning. This could be a potential issue because I see once we once, say, the origin needs to start launching, getting out, once our vehicle and other form factors, there will be multiple, back as I mentioned, the Goldilocks and the Three Bears, every different, the 3 beds, there's going to have different vehicles, and they're all going to have to cycle through. This will become a challenge quickly.
And on top of that, because we do work with some AV fleets right now, they have their charging. There's an individual at their depots to actually plug the vehicles in. So the vehicles may not have someone in them, but the charging depots have someone there. And on top of that, one consideration that we didn't bring up is, how do you manage the charging? What platform do you use to actually know when your vehicles are done charging? What the power level is? Is the station up and running? And when you think, and I should have brought this up in an earlier question, but it just dawned on me. So when you think about a fleet and how they're managing their vehicles and the charging capacity, charging status, what technology are they using for that? I would have to believe that when we get to scale, you'll want one platform, not multiple, and don't necessarily want to have to go to different networks or providers to manage your fleets.
Yeah, that makes good sense. I think I want to manage the time right, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then if there are folks in the audience, if we have time for a couple of minutes for questions. I was going to ask, what's the biggest challenge that you see coming forward? I'm a Mets fan. Everything's always just what's the negative Nancy perspective. And DC, it's a toxic combination. But I want to pivot and just, for this part, and we'll get to maybe a couple of questions, what you see as the biggest opportunity in the autonomous vehicle space in the next 2 to 3 years from each of your respective perspectives. I think there's just a lot of pent-up energy. There's a lot of developments. I've used the analogy before of kind of a hydraulic pump. From regulations and law are so weird, and their legacy, different kinds of things, that the pressure to innovate kind of pushes it out in weird ways. It's sort of an unnatural way of doing things. And so that's taking place. But given all that, what's the biggest opportunity to scale autonomous vehicles from your own company's perspective, or maybe that you're looking out and you're seeing something in the sector that you think is another kind of opportunity? But just maybe we'll start with Deana, we'll go that way.
Yeah, and I touched on this a bit earlier. I think my perspective is we are very early in transition to EVs, even earlier for AVs. And what I've seen work successfully so far is grants and incentives from governments, from utilities, and they're there to help promote adoption, to help build the foundation, and I think that engagement and involvement is needed to continue because we're still very, very early, and without that support, without that engagement, I'm not quite sure that we'll get to where we want to be.
Aftermarket solutions. What I mean by this is I see our vehicle and other vehicles get out there, and we can't even fathom what usage they're going to get. So when I say aftermarket, I foresee someone taking a scan of the inside of our vehicle, because it can handle another 4,000 pounds, putting in another delivery service, such as someone providing like food deserts that are out there. But they'll have delivery services, air-conditioned within the air-conditioned unit itself, different form factors, things to make it additionally more functional. But this type of thing, if I was an entrepreneur wanting to get in to put additional functionality for the units themselves because they need to constantly run, this is what I think the opportunity for the future of this area is.
I think the biggest opportunity in my mind is also potentially the biggest threat. I think they sit side by side depending on execution, and it's community engagement and bringing the community, bringing people along on the journey. Over the next few years, this can either be done really effectively and really bringing people in as part of it. And as someone who's had the pleasure and privilege of taking some of these trips in autonomous vehicles. It is magical, and it's a transformative experience. Finding ways to bring a broader subset of the population along on this journey is doing that really well in the next few years will be a huge opportunity. Getting it wrong could be a huge challenge. That's certainly front of mind from my perspective.
It's all great perspectives. Want to be mindful of time here. I'm grateful you all were able to do this, and I learned a lot. So please give a round of applause to the panelists here. Again, mindful of time, maybe we'll take one or two questions. Does that work? I think there's a microphone here.
Greetings, panelists. When it comes to driving a car, it's a lot fun. Very much part of the fun is you get to steer your own car and, take it on scenic drives and the challenges of being on the road. It helps critical thinking skills. The majority of Americans just don't want autonomous vehicles. They want to maintain what they have, what they love, right, about cars and trucks. One thing for certain, in my opinion, I don't want Google Maps driving me, huh? Mm-hmm. I would, and neither would I hop on a bus or a plane or a train without a human operator with full control over his or her vehicle. For example, in airliners, people train hard to become pilots. And why take this dream away from them? Huh? This would take away at least a third of all jobs if autonomous vehicles are deployed.
Yeah, appreciate the perspective. Thank you so much.
Can I make a comment to that? There will be adapters and people that don't adapt. The thing that we don't take into account, especially for me having so much experience being in Japan, whether the transportation for public transportation, the amount of stress that driving every day in Detroit traffic with people that have road rage constantly and worrying about my personal health, riding something that something else is taking control and is going to be more active than myself, and me relaxing and maybe focusing on an activity that I need to get done is such a benefit. I think that once you get into it, it'll be addictive.
That's good. We'll take one more question because I know we're running short on time. Go ahead.
Thanks, Ariel. Great panel. I just wanted to actually make a comment. You asked what was missing, and one of the things that has started to come together is a number of the leading public sector leaders in the transit space, Jacksonville, RTC Nevada, Houston Metro, and a number of others have put together a coalition that's public sector led that's focused on advancing the interests of shared use electric autonomous shared use mobility. As you know, in the conversations that occur around autonomous vehicles, they kind of get lumped together. So the robotaxis, the commercial vehicles, and the shuttles are all in the same conversation. And the answers aren't necessarily the same. And so I just wanted to share that with you because I think it's a real advance, and I think there are many of the folks in this room will be members.
Yeah, appreciate
thank you
that.
For letting
it's
me.
a good development. We saw the announcement. I think folks should pay attention to that. All right, I want to be, again, respectful of time, so thanks again, everyone, and we'll move on to the next.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second day of the 11th annual FAV Summit.
All right, I'm honored to introduce our next speaker today. A good friend of mine. In fact, the founder of the first .com in 1989. He's chairman emeritus of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, founding faculty at Singularity University, and now one of the leading experts and speakers on self-driving cars. Let me introduce my friend, Brad Templeton. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, we got some, yes, we have some sound. Just a couple of weeks ago, decided to come here and do this because, as I'm sure you've all seen, there's been this incredible battle, or whatever you want to call it, in San Francisco, the world's first robo-taxi city, between a whole bunch of parties, of course, the two leading robo-taxi companies in the United States, Cruise and Waymo, and the city of San Francisco, the municipal transit agency, the fire department, the police department a little bit, some public groups in both directions. So I thought it would be great to come and summarize, because I live in the Bay Area and, of course, try and follow everything in the self-driving space very closely and know all the people involved here, to give you a background about what's going on and what it means for how this technology will be accepted by the public, how it will be adapted, how regulators will respond to it, how they should respond to it. In fact, we're going to have some moral philosophy. You might hear words like deontological in this talk. I'll try and keep those words out of there. But we are going to talk a little bit about how you think about this, how you think about risk, how you think about reward, and how it applies to these technologies. Okay, so now I'll briefly mention, though, that this has been, again, and last year I gave you a summary of some of the news in the field, and I'm sure you're up on this, but just even in the last couple of days, a whole bunch of things have happened. The map is getting more populated. We have now seen announced robotaxi plans, aside from the cities that they're operating in today with no one in the vehicle, San Francisco, Austin, Phoenix. Cruise in particular has announced that it will be deploying in a whole bunch of cities, Waymo, so we'll see Los Angeles, Charlotte. Well, you can read the list. I'm sure you've seen these lists. We're into what I call the land rush for robotaxi development. The technology is starting to work, and companies are starting to say, we want to be first into a city, hoping that being first gives them a long-term business advantage. But I called San Francisco the first robotaxi city, but there's a lot going on in China as well. So just a few days ago, Baidu's Apollo project announced that they were opening up a fleet of 300 vehicles in Wuhan. That's one of the largest fleets out there. That they have now done 4 million, they cover 4 million people. They've done, I think, 3 million miles of operations. Wuhan, Shanghai, Beijing, not necessarily in the downtown, and Shenzhen have all got multiple robotaxi companies operating in them. So while San Francisco has been the showcase of the world and part of Silicon Valley, the world capital of technology, don't think it's only happening here. We just obviously don't get as much news from China, and you can't always trust the news from China, but nonetheless, there is stuff going on there. I'm sure you also saw that Waymo decided to pause trucking the same week that Aurora got $820 million investment to do more trucking. So, investors cannot make up their mind. This year we saw Ford shut down Argo, and then we just saw this week SoftBank put $1 billion into Brian Selesky and the others at the Argo team who were kicked out of Ford, and lo and behold, there they go, they've raised another $1 billion, this time to do trucking instead of self-driving vehicles. And we'll talk about this later in this session. This chart is a chart that was released 2 days ago by Waymo, produced by Swiss Re, the reinsurance company. We're going to talk about insurance companies and their potential role here, showing how successful they've been at safety from an insurance company's perspective. And the results, if you didn't see them, were very good. I'll talk about them more a little bit later on. But let's look at San Francisco, the robotaxi city. It's very funny. San Francisco, many people think of it as the world's technology capital in combination with Silicon Valley, so many high-tech companies. You may or may not remember that when Dean Kamen was trying to get the Segway, and the Segway never became what Dean wanted it to be, but while he was trying to put it out and say, here's a new way to get around cities for individuals, he went around all the cities and said, would you be accepting the Segway? Most of them were. San Francisco was the one city to ban it before it was even on the streets or sidewalks. I helped build this company, Starship. We make delivery robots. They've done 5 million deliveries now for money. It's a real autonomous robot business that you may not know about. Nonetheless, only one city decided preemptively to ban these sidewalk robots, and it was San Francisco. So it's a little bit of the world's technology capital and the world's Luddism capital at the same time. Nonetheless, the companies are there. Obviously, both Waymo and Cruise are headquartered in the Bay Area, Cruise right in San Francisco. So it's naturally where they would like to be operating. It's one of the few cities in the United States that's ready for a taxi business. Obviously, Manhattan and Boston and outside the United States, Toronto and Vancouver also qualify. San Francisco has no snow, and most people want to, sort of get the no snow part working first before they try skidding, automated skidding. So it's a natural choice for them to be, and it hasn't been entirely welcoming. Now, as most of you know, because a lot of you work in the regulatory space, the cities don't get regulatory authority over this. It belongs to the states, which get to control the rules of the road and how driving operates. The cities own their curbs and sidewalks, which is why they could ban segways and delivery robots. But the cities do not set the rules of the road on the street. They don't license vehicles. And so they've been a bit frustrated at having no role in this, and they have let that frustration show. Of course, you know that Cruise was based in San Francisco, began its operations there. Waymo began in the Phoenix area and then moved very quickly into San Francisco. Zoox is also testing a lot of vehicles in the city, as are a few other companies. They are not doing commercial service. But yes, we've got trouble. We saw a lot of complaints immediately about Cruise operations, about Waymo operations. Some of these pictures are very blurry. I was making this on the airplane with United Wi-Fi. I don't recommend this. Cruise has had a number of problems where their vehicles are stalling, and they're just stopping in the middle of the street, and sometimes needing, they publish the exact numbers, but sometimes needing a rescue, remote rescue, which is literally a human driver comes out and gets in the vehicle and takes it away. Hope that doesn't happen too often, but it's certainly happening enough for people to notice it, and it's definitely annoying people. And this is a photograph from the ARTS, the Transportation Research Board conference, which some of you were at, where there were presentations by both the head of the San Francisco Municipal Transit Agency, known as MUNI there, she's there, and also their chief autonomous vehicle agent who is giving this presentation. And they were, shall we say, a little bit negative about the robotaxis in their city. And they started with one of the first problems that they complained about, something I call PUDO, pickup and drop-off, or if you remember the Car Talk show, they always talked about their Russian chauffeur, Pikov and Dropov. So this is, to be perfectly frank, something that maybe the companies didn't think about. They took an approach of, we got to get these things to drive, and Uber drivers never pull over precisely to the curb to drop you off. So we're going to worry about that later. They will worry about it. It's actually a pretty hard problem. It's not a rocket science problem like safe driving, but it's a nitty-gritty detail problem about just how do I very quickly get in and out of parking spaces and drop-off spaces. And so they just didn't at first, and the city was going, what the hell are you doing? That's not allowed. It doesn't matter that all the Uber drivers and cab drivers do it. So that immediately pissed off the city. Cruise is going to be a little bit of the poor stepchild in this particular case. They've definitely had more visible problems than Waymo has. Every time I ask them about that, they say, we are driving more miles in San Francisco, so expect us to have more problems than Waymo. I say, all right, well, would both of you guys just tell me exactly how many miles you're driving so I can calculate this? No, we won't. We won't give you those exact numbers to let you do those calculations. They are a little bit close to the vest on that. It's actually interesting. Oh, another thing that got the city annoyed, and this was something admittedly I don't think anyone really thought of, was that if you fall asleep drunk, sorry, I didn't say drunk, but I mean that's the main reason that this happens. But if you fall asleep in your vehicle and the ride ends and they say, okay, your ride's over, would you kind of like to get out? And you don't. They don't know what to do about it. They just see a guy lying there comatose. And so they've ended up calling 911 to wake these people up. And 911 says, we have other things to do. And I think they're absolutely right about that. So this was something that wasn't thought of in advance, and again, has pissed off the emergency services in San Francisco. What pissed them off more has been when these vehicles have gotten stuck in anything involving an emergency vehicle going to an emergency scene or at an emergency scene. And this has happened It's not happening every day, but it's definitely happened enough to get noticed. The fire crews have gotten up. There was one incident, fairly famous incident with crews. It was about 6 months ago, and a vehicle was coming into a fire scene. And when I talked to the crews representatives, they say it had already figured everything out and was stopped, but the fire department decided it's trying to attack us, and they smashed its window in order to figuring that might get it to stop. And of course, the crew says it was already stopped when you smashed the window. So it did work. You didn't see it continue on towards you. But these sort of battles are happening. One of the interesting elements of this, and it ties to what we want to talk about when we're looking at this topic, is that these problems are in a way happening because of too much caution. I think, do I have that phrase on? No, I don't. I've got to go back and we'll talk about this in a second. As I say, this is a brand new presentation, so I don't yet know the order of slides in my mind. But I'm going to tell you about this phenomenon of too much caution. So these vehicles are designed to drive in as many situations as they can, but to occasionally they will run into things which they cannot handle and which will confuse them. And when that happens, the vehicles try to, they may already be stopped, or they try and stop in a safe space. And then they signal the remote assistance room at the company, where people can look out all the cameras on their screens, and they cannot drive the vehicle with a remote steering wheel, but they can give the vehicle advice, sort of, here's how to get out of this, turn left there, take this lane, that sort of remote advising rather than remote driving. And this is the solution they've come up with to make the vehicles handle every situation. It does not work if there is not a data connection in order to do that over, and that's also important. But nonetheless, that's the solution. But they've often, and at least often enough, found themselves in a situation where they're stuck in something like there's a fire, or there's a scene of a fire, there's fire trucks. The vehicle can't figure out exactly what to do. The human being is going to connect and look at it. And the human being decides, I don't know, or they're stuck in traffic is another example. I don't know if we can really 100% safely use remote assistance to get out of this, right? Because it is a confusing situation, and so they decide we cannot get out of this. We will send a human being to drive the vehicle out of this, and that can take 10 to 15 minutes. I think the average is about 12 minutes, they said. So they keep people stationed around the city in order to make that happen. Now, this is not something that human beings do. Of course, everyone is hoping these vehicles will be safer than human beings. Some people say they already are there, but they are not the same as human beings. And this is not a problem that human cars ever have. Human cars don't just sit for 15 minutes confused in the middle of the road in a traffic jam, and that is causing traffic disruption. And it's very occasionally causing disruption with emergency vehicles, which is what's caused the emergency departments to get so upset. It has also occasionally happened in front of transit vehicles. So vehicles have stalled and they've blocked a streetcar. Streetcars cannot drive around you, of course. They're on rails. And this is the head of the transit agency getting upset about that. So yes, this is where I meant to talk about this idea that an abundance of caution, a decision to say, here in our early days where we're focused almost entirely on not hitting anybody, not hurting anything, and being safe, makes them be too conservative on the road. It makes them say, let's take the choice which is guaranteed not to hit anyone, which is leave the vehicle in the middle of the road for 15 minutes, annoying the hell out of people. But you're sure you're not going to hit something. And a lot of factors in the regulatory regime, in the liability regime, and even they thought in the public impression regime, said that's the right thing to do. Number one, don't hit something. And then number two, be a good citizen on the roads. But real human driving is a different mix. So bizarrely, I'm going to tell you, we might be too safety focused. And that might even be the fault of, I don't know if it's the fault of the regulators, but it's the fault of fear of the regulators, which makes people not be handling that balance of safety and road citizenship, which is necessary for humans to drive. So here's the results. This is a map from, I think, San Francisco Chronicle, showing how many crashes there have been. And Cruise, I think, has done 3 million miles. Waymo has done a little more than that, but most of those in Phoenix. And the purple dots are Zooks, I believe, which is you're not even hearing about. However, This number of crashes is, it's almost all of them, as it turns out when you look at the crash reports, are the vehicle was hit by somebody else. They were sitting, stopped at a light, and somebody rear-ended them. Only 3 of them, I think, are accidents which were the fault of the autonomous vehicle. At least, or maybe it's 3. There are 3 injury-related accidents, minor injury-related accidents, where the fault of the autonomous vehicle. The vast bulk of these are not mistakes by the autonomous vehicle. There is occasional speculation that the conservative and unusual driving style of the vehicles might be generating more accidents that are the fault of someone else, that people don't expect the vehicle to do what it does. However, this is the map that we've seen. But here's an important message, and one of the key messages I want to give about this talk, which is that I don't think most people expected this. These vehicles are out there to cause problems. That is the purpose of their testing, is to find the problems, to find them and fix them. So when people come out and say, these vehicles are doing these wrong things, and it's disruptive, and we can't have this, there was never an option not to have that happen. The purpose of the testing is to find the problems and fix them. And as I'll say again later, that's the great thing about robots. Robots, once they find a problem, you fix it, and they don't do it again, which is very different from human beings. Now, Cruise, however, has had a few more problems, as I said, and one of Cruise's worst incidents, as you see here. Now, by the way, the bus was fine. Even the Cruise was not entirely damaged. It was a moderately low-speed collision, and there was no injuries or anything of that sort. But this did bother me. This accident bothered me a lot, and I won't go into all the details on it. But you shouldn't hit a bus, is I think a good rule. And it was a very interesting accident from an internal standpoint, which is to say that Cruise this was an articulated bus, a bendy bus. And because those are really effectively a front bus carrying the back of the bus as a trailer, they act differently on the road and tracking them and moving, and then they basically made a very stupid mistake and allowed that to happen. Now, I believe that this was a bad sign for Cruise because it should have been the case that they wouldn't hit the bus even when they didn't understand what an articulated bus was doing. And I have disputed with them on that. But nonetheless, this is one of the problems they've had. But it's one of the few crashes. I will also mention, this is a picture I took just a couple of days in Utah. It's very beautiful in Utah, I got to tell you that. But there is also a company which some people think is a player in the self-driving space, but which is not. I own one of their cars. I love their car. However, they don't know anything about self-driving. And I know what Kathy told you last night. She might have given you a slightly different impression than that. But nonetheless, the bad news is that because they call their product a self-driving product, it does create a lot of confusion in the marketplace, and people are attributing the crashes happening with these, which are actually driver assist crashes, confusing them with self-driving crashes. So anyway, the city of San Francisco was upset, and so there was this negative reaction. And in fact, the regulation of these vehicles in California is by both the Department of Motor Vehicles, which licenses them and gives them the actual permits to be out on the roads, but also by the California Public Utilities Commission. And the CPUC licenses them to run a taxi service. So they're mostly about, consumer protection and pricing for passengers. And it happened that the CPUC was the next body which would be holding hearings on applications by the companies to expand their services. They wanted to start charging money. They were giving rides for free up until this point. They wanted to expand where they were going, and they needed to appeal to the CPUC to do that. The city of San Francisco, seeing they didn't have any regulatory authority, decided they would actually appeal to the CPUC and say, don't let them expand their services. And so they filed a number of briefs and appeared, and one commissioner at the CPUC was somewhat sympathetic to them and helped them a little bit, although, spoiler alert, as I'm sure you already know, the commission voted with only one negative vote to allow the permits and allow the expansion in the early part of August. Now, as I said, the city itself, the transit agency, was pushing for this not to happen. They did, particularly though, probably the biggest enemy is this woman who is the fire chief in San Francisco. And she has been particularly bothered, as actually one would expect her to be as fire chief, with the incidents, now 77 of them in 2023, where there's been a negative encounter between one of her fire trucks and most of the cruise vehicles, occasionally the Waymo vehicles. But the city protested the CPUC, and then they did another thing, which those of you who get into the nitty-gritty of state and city regulation may blanch at or love, which is they said, okay, fine, we can't regulate you, but we do own the zoning, and Waymo was trying to put in a new depot, and they needed a parking lot, not for the vehicles, but for their employees who worked at the depot to park, and the city just said, nah, you can't have that. And not for any valid reason. It was simply because they wanted to say, you want to fight with us? Bring it on. So should cities do that? I mean, the reason that cities don't regulate this is because it was decided at a higher level, at a general public policy level, that there are something like 20,000 medium to large urban entities in the United States, and having 20,000 different regulatory bodies eventually, but even having a few score of those bodies in the early days, would really not be regulatory and would not be conducive, to innovation. Well, anyway, the city still wanted to play with that. The sides weren't talking with each other. They both told me, oh, I've tried to meet with them, they won't meet with me. So I don't know what that means. The city made, I think, relatively reasonable requests for data. They wanted more data, and the companies are being a little bit shy about how much data that they're putting out. And in part, the companies are expressing that resistance to the idea of, do we want to give data to 20,000 different eventual urban entities in the forms that they all want? And so they want to basically stick to within what they think is their regulatory boundaries and reduce their own regulatory workload. But they haven't been giving out that data, although Waymo has been more willing to publish data than Cruise has been. But still, both of them publish data which obviously is the kind of data they want to publish and which reflects well on them. However, the city did get the CPUC to hold a hearing specifically asking for data. Some interesting data came out of it. Some of it was, again, the sort of regulatory stuff you pay the fine lawyers to do in order to answer questions without answering them. It was interesting to watch that hearing. I'm sure any of you who have been to any kind of municipal hearing know that everyone is reasoned and calm and, strictly speaking, in the public interest. So I watched it so you don't have to. There were a lot of crazies, but it was actually quite interesting to see the balance. And Waymo and Cruise both they did send an email out to their riders, the people who use it, saying, hey, we're having a hearing. If you want to go, you can go. And other people sent out emails. So there was actually about a 50-50 balance, I think, in for and against. Most of these meetings are mostly the crazies who want to just come out, or people who have a very strong agenda. So it was very interesting to see a lot of people who just say, I'm riding in these things. It is great. Why do you want to stop this? But we also saw a lot of Uber and cab drivers afraid of employment issues relating to the technology. We saw people with financial interests expressing their view. We had, of course, as I said, the city, well, they were not in the public comment section. They were directly there. This group here is interesting. This group, wasn't created for this. It's a group that sort of little guerrilla activism, merry pranksters, if you will, who discovered, no real big surprise, these vehicles are ultra cautious. So they discovered if they stuck a traffic cone on the nose of the car would say, what the fuck? We're not supposed to see traffic cones there. And so the cars just stop, and no big surprise that they do that. And so they've been going around a little bit, standing in front of them, putting the cones on there, gumming up traffic worse. I mean, we can't let these vehicles gum up traffic. Let's protest it by gumming up traffic. But anyway, it's amusing. It's interesting to see whether this is a thing that we'll see long term, or is this just a phase that we're going to go through? Because certainly the vehicles they're not going to get road rage, right? They're not going to say, you've walked in front of me, I'm going to nudge you, and I am a 3,000-pound machine, ha, 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 human. That one's not happening. So it will work. The question is, will people get tired of it, or will they want to do it long term? Because otherwise they can disrupt. At the end of all this, as I said, with only one negative vote, the expansion permits were released. However, the week after that turned out to be rather interesting. And it was particularly a bad week for crews, and there was a lot of irony about the fact that they had just gotten this permit, and literally within a very short amount of time, a whole bunch of things went bad for them. Probably, well, I don't know if this is the worst one or not, but they were driving a block away from the CPUC hearing room where they had been granted their permit. They were driving and they were going through a green light. However, there were sirens you could hear, but you could not see the fire truck. And a fire truck, a particular fire truck which had been named in the hearing, this is ladder number 3 in San Francisco, I think it is the busiest fire truck, does the most calls per year in the country, so the fire chief was all like, oh, and how can they interfere with these beautiful people? And so this very truck, there were some conspiracy theorists who thought that wasn't a coincidence, but this very truck goes through the red light on the way to a fire and hits the crews. There is someone inside who they've never really given the details, who said they had a headache, and so they were seen by doctors. Nothing significant in the way of injuries, but maybe there's something more. We don't know if there was more than that. Now, an interesting note, though, is that under the law, as far as I can examine it, the fire truck's in the wrong here. Most people think fire truck is absolutely right. The fire engine recognition rules require you to be able to see. You don't have to stop for a truck you can't see. And it's a semi-blind corner, so you can only see the truck when you're much closer to the intersection, see the other street. And secondly, fire trucks are not allowed to just blow through red lights. They are supposed to wait until they're clear and go. There should not be if traffic is going through on a green light, whether it's supposed to or not, the fire truck has a duty to pause for it and find a hole through the traffic and get through. And they also usually will do the special siren and everything else. I'm sure you've all seen it. This is a well-established procedure for the fire truck. So chances are the crews will not be found at fault here, although the police have not made a particular determination. But frankly, hitting a fire truck or being hit by a fire truck a few days after the fire department's had a big fight with you, electric cars are heavy, but fire trucks win, is a short answer about that. The city, pissed off that they had lost the hearing battle, had their attorney file another lawsuit to the CPUC saying, please reconsider this. And then the next day, a very weird story happened. So there was a gum up in one of the busy food neighborhoods, the Italian neighborhood in San Francisco, where a bunch of cruise cars were reported. And this is the weird part. Cruise itself initially said, yeah, we're sorry about this. The reason this happened was the cell network was overloaded and we couldn't talk to our vehicles. And that shouldn't cause a traffic jam. So the cell network was overloaded in another part of town. I think I have a picture of that. Yeah, this is a picture of that, not that you can really tell from this, where there was a big music festival going on in the park. This is like 7 miles away on the other side of town. And the music festival was over and everybody was on their phones and the cell networks overloaded, and so they couldn't talk to the cars. And that caused a problem there because the cars got stuck in traffic jams. The remote assistance teams could not get through to them. And so, but strangely, they blamed the other situation on that. And then only about 4 or 5 days later, and most of the press didn't catch it, they corrected, no, sorry, we shouldn't have said that. What happened in North Beach was which was the first one I showed you, was that a pedestrian was deliberately standing in front of the vehicles, maybe one of these guys with the cones. They've never said it was one of them or not. And it happens, it's like a really narrow street with no way to get out, and so a whole bunch of cars backed up behind that, and that caused the traffic jam. So that wasn't actually a problem. The other one was a problem. Then the next day, one of the cars was going through a construction zone, and they have not said more about why it decided to drive into the construction zone right into the cement, so that wasn't a good look for them. And in fact, so much not a good look that the next day, the day after the fire engine crash, the wet cement was earlier. The day after the fire engine crash and another crash where they were going through a green light and they were T-boned by someone from a sideshow running a red light, not their fault at all as far as I can tell, The DMV, which is the real body, which does have the regulatory power, the Public Utilities Commission actually really shouldn't have even been asked about this at all. But the DMV is the body that really should be looking at this. They said, okay, crews, let's slow down for a bit. We want you to cut your fleet in half, and we're going to look into why this is going on. And so they did. And they're still operating, but they're operating at half the size. And that was a bit of a wake-up call for them. And unfortunately, their troubles didn't end. And here's a mistake. There's no, this was only property damage. It certainly looks like it's otherwise. And that's because they decided to have a fight with a backhoe. Again, backhoes win. But this one, I think, probably was their fault. And I've been trying to get some data from them on why they did this. They were just driving late at night next to the backhoe, and they felt they could turn from the middle lane. And so I don't know why they felt they could turn from the middle lane. My best theory on this is that they've been working on doing end-to-end machine learning for their planning. How many of you saw Elon Musk give his demo of the Tesla FSD version 12? Okay, you're the only one who watched it? I watched it. I watched it live. In fact, where he was driving, I was very tempted to drive over there and get in front of him. Because, that would have been a pretty big audience and say, hey, Elon, what are you doing? Brad, get out of the way. But I didn't, and Steve Jurvetson, who is on the Tesla board, also thought about doing this too. So it would have been a real great party. Okay, so I think I got to speed this up though because these go. So this is a real crash, and so who knows what's going to happen with their DMV investigation? They got their first real protest march. There you go, people protesting in front of the. And then about 3-4 days ago, another story of big contention between them. The fire department said that they were responding, or they with some ambulances were responding to a pedestrian who'd been hit by a car. The car was human driver. Many people thought the irony of this is, hey, who's really killing people on the streets? It is the human drivers who are doing this. This person was hit, and the fire department said the ambulances that came to take him to the hospital couldn't get out because there were cruise vehicles blocking the area, and the patient died when about half an hour after getting to the hospital. And they're saying that this person might not have died if hadn't been delayed for some amount of time. But Cruise released, this is one of the few times they released their videos. A bad step, by the way, because I think if you release videos rarely, it means you only release them when they're in your favor, as opposed to, and why aren't you releasing the others? But they released videos showing the fire department story was entirely false, that other ambulances drove by them at the same time, that the first vehicle left as soon as it got a green light. And I don't know, I haven't seen the videos myself, but reports suggest that the fire department, I'm not saying lied, because I don't think they're malicious in that way or would lie about something like that, but definitely get a very different perspective. And the one nice thing about